Welcome back for course part 6 out of 11 on our class on analog space missions. Today we'll be talking about spacesuits. Little warning, we have some really cool photos coming on today. Obviously spacesuits always a very nice part of things, although not necessarily the most important part of analog space missions. So what we'll discuss today is the purpose of spacesuits. Why do you have them in analog space missions? What are the donning and doffing procedures? Actually quite important, although you might not think it. Then what are the differences between real spacesuits and spacesuits for analog space missions? What are some of the types of spacesuits that we focus on in analog space mission? And what are some of the complexities that we have to take into account when we design a spacesuit, regardless if it was for a space mission or an analog space mission? So, cool photo, I did promise it. That's one of the pictures from Avandi mission from the Austrian Space Forum in non-agency analog space missions. So remember, there was a difference between agency-led analog space missions, such as those by NASA, ESA, JAXA, Roscosmos, which have much bigger budget and doing real missions, and have more volunteer-based analog space missions, which usually have lower budgets, are not necessarily run the whole time, and obviously do not always lead to real space missions. So obviously the budgets are quite different, the focus is quite different, and the danger is also obviously very different in the end. So you'll see big differences, and one of the big differences that you see in analog space mission versus real space mission is actually the spacesuit. The reason for that is that the spacesuit is actually extremely expensive. It's a very complex piece of equipment, and it's not always needed for an analog space mission. Like you don't, even an astronaut does not always need to do an EVA. However, when you go to space, when you go to the moon or Mars or the ISS, or even when you're doing, just a small orbital flight, small, I mean still pretty big, but you see what I mean, you still need a spacesuit. Basically what can happen is you can have a decompression valve that can fail and you could actually die upon re-entry or even, launch. So now it's actually mandatory to wear a spacesuit when you launch and when you come back to Earth. So even if you were to not go outside of the spacecraft and not perform an EVA, extravehicular activity, you would still need a spacesuit if you were to go to space in any point. Whereas an analog space mission, we could technically enter the base without a spacesuit. Actually, usually crews are 6, 8, even 10 people. Normally you don't even have that amount of spacesuits in analog missions because of the price again. So normally you enter the base and then you could be not going out for several months at all, and you wouldn't need a spacesuit therefore. You could obviously put one just to simulate, emergency procedures and evacuation, but it really depends on what kind of analog space mission you're actually running. So yeah, cool picture of one of the spacesuits. One thing that we're going to talk about later is, can you see this kind of cap on top? So this obviously in a real spacesuit wouldn't be like that, because in a spacesuit you would be looking everywhere. Right there, what they need to see is what's happening down on their feet, because they're walking on Earth. Obviously in space you could possibly be floating, looking left and right, maybe, solving something upside down, and therefore you would need really very good visibility also in that direction. If you need to know a lot about that kind of spacesuit, I recommend that you bugger Gernot Grömer, who's one of the heads of the Austrian Space Forum and possibly the best person to explain the spacesuit that was developed there. So, question. If they're so expensive, why do we have them in analog missions? So basically, if you're going to go out from your habitat, you can't just go out like this. If you were to do that, you would break the simulation. You would be saying, oh look, Mars has already been terraformed, we can go outside and it's safe. No, okay, obviously we're not there yet, and therefore you need to keep that simulation real. So for example, if I were to blow a fresh breeze on your face and you could smell flowers and you could hear the birds chirping, you would feel on Earth. It would really break the simulation, which is already not necessarily very strong. So depending on where you are. So the spacesuit is a way of telling you you're not going outside in a normal environment. You're going outside, it's dangerous, you can't breathe the air there, it's not the right temperature, there's radiation, you need protection. Obviously, the complexity of the spacesuit depends a lot on the analog mission. It's very, very, very variable. But in general, the same purpose. It's really just you need to keep the simulation, you need to keep the illusion that you're not on Earth. You are not in a breathable atmosphere. You need to be very aware of that. And the other thing is, if you were to just go outside and you'd be able to use your body as you do normally to perform experiments, you wouldn't have the added difficulty that comes with spacesuits. Spacesuits are notoriously annoying to do stuff with. Like, you have what we call flipper fingers. It's difficult to hold stuff, it's difficult to move around, so it's really not something that is fun. It's not fun to do anyway. It's beautiful if you see Earth, but it's not fun. It's tedious. So having those really big, what we would say in French, bonhomme Michelin, really does really complex apparatus that make it really difficult to move, actually is a good way to really simulate this annoyance, and it also tests your patience. Also tells you how much time would you take to actually install this thing. Maybe if you were to do it without any spacesuit, it would take you half an hour. With the spacesuit, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Maybe you need a break in between because you're so exhausted. So it's all of this that you need to take into account. And lastly, if we talk about time, there's obviously in the flight plan, you would need preparation time for before, during, and after. Okay, so how do you put the spacesuits? How long does it take you to do the experiment? And after, how do you take it off? Do you just take it off and throw it on the floor and wait for somebody to clean it for you? Or do you actually do a checkup yourself on it? And we're going to talk about this right now. So, donning and doffing procedures. Why do you need them? Why don't you just put the spacesuits? One thing, obviously expensive. If you just put it like this and you tear it open, somebody's not going to be happy. Other things. When you have spacesuits, obviously on Earth it's a bit different, but you can still simulate the very extreme environment where ventilation could be required. So that was the case, for example, for Mars 500. If you have ventilation, you need good ventilation, otherwise you have an excess of CO2, then you need absolutely check it. If you put it, you could die, you could pass out, something could happen to you. So ventilation has to be checked. Pressurization has to be checked also for that. Okay, so it's in correlation, ventilation. Why do I separate them? Because ventilation is more about the oxygen, the pressurization is more about the integrity of the spacesuit. So you have to check, has there been any damage? For example, if you do an EVA and then you fall down because you're on Earth, so still gravity, and you damage your spacesuit and you make a little leak on it, well, you might not see it right away, but you actually might, once you give your spacesuit to another astronaut, and they go up, they might actually be in deep trouble because that small leak will have leaked again and again the oxygen coming in, and then the person might pass out and then they might fall and hit their head, etc, etc. And obviously in space would be even worse, the consequences. So you have to check the ventilation. Is it working? Is it working correctly? As in, is it the correct rate for you to get the proper amount of oxygen? And then, is there any leaks? Is there any chance that on the long term something's going to happen? So the first thing you do when you're going to put your spacesuit and you look at your spacesuits and you check all the boxes, you say, okay, glove, fine, arm, fine, you know. Usually you do it before you actually put it on, but sometimes it's easier if you have somebody who does it with you because you see exactly when the material is stretched. You can find any holes in it. But this is one of the things that it's good to do that repetition. It's good to understand, look, if you were to be a real astronaut tomorrow, this would be life and death. This would be really, like, except if you, obviously Alexei Leonov, and you managed to come in a spacecraft while doing the first EVA in the world and having a spacesuit that's not pressured the right way and having to make a leak your own way to get back in, unless that man, it's very unlikely that you would survive that. So that's something that you really need to be aware of. It's very, very important. Then the other thing is obviously spacesuits provide radiation and foreign object protection, so such as dust and dirt. For the moon, we had to actually check what kind of dust was on the moon and see if it was actually damaging the kind of material. And I think the number of layers is about 15 or 16 different layers for some of the spacesuits that you need. You usually have also different spacesuit depending on which kind of foreign body you would do. Would you be on the EVA on a rock, or would you be on the EVA outside the space station? Is there any atmosphere that can shield you from radiation? Is there any chance of you getting, I don't know, like your helmet completely scratched because of a sandstorm? What is happening? So depending on the situation, you need extremely high resistant materials and protection. To come back about the ventilation, one crucial thing that I should have mentioned at that point, mention it now, is obviously the temperature control. In Analogue missions, you might be in extreme environments, so it's going to be also important, but it's not going to be as variable as when you are in direct sunlight on the International Space Station and then normal sunlight and direct sunlight. It's not the same, 100, 150 degrees difference in temperature, right? So you don't have, cooling and heating systems that are as efficient, or not as, it's not needed. However, you do have some in some of the more advanced Analogue space mission suits, and they can be quite interesting, because also if you were to have an Analogue mission both in winter and then in summer and you want to use the same spacesuit, it helps to have both systems in place to make sure you can use them in both situations. Often those missions are in extreme environment, as we saw before, and that means that you might have very, very cold weather, like say minus 15, minus 20 degrees, and you could be in the desert and they could go to 35, 40 degrees. Obviously, you might try not to do when it's the most extreme temperatures, but still, sometimes you have high temperatures. To give you an example of, spacesuits, simply like when you have one that is been used, was prepared for February and had very good thermal insulation, and then it was used for July, then it's already problematic. It's not really not fun. Anyway, other things that you might want to consider and that you want to check also for the donning and doffing procedures is how accessible are all the equipment that you might need, and what are they all there. So do an inventory. What do I mean about equipment, like accessories? Cameras. Usually it helps to have a GoPro on your head or somewhere else, so that Mission Control Center and your base can see what you're doing. But also you can record it, and then later on you can view them if you're doing experiments. For example, the PI can then review that video and see, oh, actually we could see that this was the problem, is that it was maybe the gloves were the problem, that you're just not enough finesse, not able to really handle tiny objects or whatever it is. And they can try to assess it and say, well, next time we probably need more time for this experiment, or we need some extra tools so that the Analogue astronaut can perform correctly the mission. Other things that you might need is the first aid kit. Obviously you might ask, well, how would you use a first aid kit if you're not supposed to remove the spacesuits? Obviously, if one of the Analogue astronauts falls and passes out, you're going to remove the helmet, you're going to do something, unless obviously you are in a non-breathable atmosphere, but it's usually not the case in an Analogue space mission. The other reason why you have a first aid kit is actually for the spacesuits itself. If you were to fall and make a leak inside your spacesuit, you can use some of the equipment that's in the first aid kit, like tape, to actually mend the spacesuit, and that actually protects you. So the first aid kit is not just for your biological safety, it's just for also the spacesuit that then, medically has an impact. Other things, maps, phones, whatever it is that you actually need. Usually radios. With the helmet, you tend to not be able to hear anything, so it's good to have it. You can always add things like, if you sweat a lot, you can put some pads under the helmet, you can try to put some food or some water. Usually in Analogue spacesuits, it's not as complex. It's quite difficult to store everything. So majority of them don't have space for food and water, but it's something that you can work on if you're interested. And lastly, again, not a majority of Analogue space missions have it, but you can test an exoskeleton. So an exoskeleton would normally be used to help you in for example, carrying very heavy load or doing very tough movements. In some cases, you can use it to actually reduce the ability of doing movements and really simulate being on space. So yeah, you can also add exoskeletons. You can read some research by the Australian Space Forum on it if you're interested. But yeah, so it's really not a majority of analog space mission, but it's something that I think is going to come more and more into play, because when you want to install bases on the moon and Mars and you can't always use robots, then you're going to have to do some heavy lifting. And of course, with reduced gravity, it's not as bad, but because of the added complexity of the spacesuit, it could help to have this kind of exoskeleton to help you manage the spacesuits. Another thing is spacesuits can be extremely heavy, so even if you weigh a bit less, having an exoskeleton can be of a huge help. Now, what's the difference between a real and analog space mission suit? So, for example, I mentioned the ventilation system. For Mars 500, they had an EVA module where the air was not breathable. Okay, it was toxic. So in that case, yes, the spacesuit ventilation has to be impeccable. You can't just put a helmet where half of your neck is sticking out and just go there. No, it has to be perfect. It has to be fine, otherwise they die. And the problem is, because it's an analog space mission, you're still a little bit isolated, right? So it takes some time for people to come in and save your life. Same as it would be in space. In space, it would also be critical, so it's a very good simulation. So you have to make sure that's fine. Again, not a majority. But on the right-hand side, you can see a really cool picture that was taken in November 7, 2012, and that's Ray Wiseman from NASA. Behind this was Alexander Guest, like just from behind from ESA. And they were like training basically in what we call EMU spacesuits. It's the extravehicular mobility unit spacesuits, and it's in the NBL, the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory near NASA. So the NBL is really this absolutely huge facility, which is an underground pool where you have a sort of ISS makeshift submerged in it, and this is where analog astronauts, real astronauts, actually train. They train to, perform any like repair works or installation of, for example, solar panels or whatever it is on the International Space Station. It's a really, really tough training, possibly the best analog space mission in the world, because they do really almost everything as they would do in space, except in water. But the fact that they have this water, the fact that they're floating and they have this real spacesuit, it actually really simulates how they would be doing an EVA. Apparently it's still a little bit different when they go to space. They still feel a difference compared to that training, but still the best training that you can actually do. So absolutely huge. But again, most people don't have access to that, and most analog space missions, which are not agency-led, do not have such items. For example, if you look at the Hydronaut, which is underwater, you wouldn't have a spacesuit like this. You're still underwater, you can still do some jobs, etc., but you don't have a full ISS facility, you don't have a full spacesuit used for that. So yeah, the budget really, really different. And you need to see where you walk on Earth again. So that's one of the big differences. The visibility that you would need, the kind of tools that you would use. For example, the radio communication when you're on Earth can be outside of your spacesuit. You could have a walkie-talkie. Whereas if you're underwater like this, or you're in space, you're probably going to have it in your ear, okay? So accessibility of things is quite different. You also have to think, well, if you have fog on your helmet when you're on Earth, well, you could technically break slightly the simulation and just remove the fog if you can't see anything. If you're underwater and in space, you can't do that, okay? You have to be fully autonomous in your spacesuits. Basically, your spacesuit is like a spacecraft on its own, okay? It's really big. It's not as big as, a real module, but it's quite big. And it has everything you need in it, from your toilet, to your food, to your drinks, to your wipe, to your communication, etc. And the only thing you probably don't do it is take a nap, although you sometimes do it before when you do the doning and oxygen saturation. In an analog space mission, it's way less of a spacecraft. It's more this tool that really creates this simulation continuation. So, types of spacesuits that you find in an analog space mission. I haven't put all of them, but I put 3 different kinds. On the left you can see a high seas spacesuit, in the middle you see an Austrian space program spacesuit that we saw before, and on the right side you see Astroland. Majority of spacesuits from analog space missions are just a jumpsuit with motorbike helmet. And on the motorbike helmet, you can put a little GoPro, and you can put a communication in your ear, etc., etc. But usually you don't have ventilation systems, you don't have thermal systems, you don't have really that many things in it, because you can still simulate things. It's still pretty tough to walk around in a jumpsuit with a helmet in the desert, so it already kind of toughens the work, and it serves already a purpose. But here you can see like some different aspects. So obviously the one from the Austrian Space Forum, if you look at it, it's about 50 kilos, a wood spacesuit, and it has really a massive focus on the life support system. So really just from the ventilation to the thermal regulation to having water in it, have good communication. They have in front, you can see a little toolbox with a mirror so they can see, up. So it's quite interesting to see that they really focus on this life support system. Whereas on the right hand side, you can see those spacesuits are a bit more snug. They're a little bit more like what SpaceX would have as spacesuit. They look really, really cool. And so they have life support systems, but they're not as advanced as the Austrian Space Forum. And the reason why they're a bit more snug is because the astronauts in this cave, in the astronaut base, have to actually perform climbing and walking in a very dangerous path. So in their case, what is very, very important is the ease of movement. They need to be able to climb, they need to be able to walk around, they need to be able to not fall, if they stumble, to catch themselves back, which is something I wouldn't want to do in the outer spacesuit. I mean, a 50-kilo spacesuit like this, I bet you feel like a turtle if you fall on your back on that. So you can already see like different missions incur different spacesuits, not just from a budget, but just from where are you, what are you gonna do, what kind of experiments are you aiming for. Yeah, so there's other missions why they would focus, for example, on the helmet development or style, but it's really an extremely wide range, and it's not, if you were to participate in an Analogue space mission, you see a mission where the spacesuits are not really advanced, it doesn't mean it's a bad Analogue space mission. It just means that they haven't put the focus on that part. They could still be bad, but it's just that they focus mainly on maybe the experiments or the habitats themselves or the astronaut crew selection, etc., etc. So you'll be quite surprised, I guess, sometimes when you see differences. But it's still very interesting to see that, yeah, you can create quite a bit of simulation in quite tough conditions, even with a very simple spacesuit. Now, okay, so I didn't mention the complexity of spacesuits. So abrasion and dust resistance, we didn't mention about how you need to be resistant to a lot of things. Another thing that you might think about in abrasion and dust resistance is reusability. So for example, during the Apollo missions, apparently per mission, so crew of 3, they had 15 spacesuits, because each astronaut had spacesuits for the flight, then for the EVA, then I had the backup, and it's just like the amount of space you need is absolutely huge, and you need to be able to check on them. You need to make sure that they resist things. After I wore that spacesuit, it was absolutely completely green and dusty, and it wasn't the end of the world. But for example, we did break the center of the trousers. The trousers were not at the right size, and basically we cut a massive hole in it, and then we had to spend time repairing them. If we had been in a not normal atmosphere pressure, we would have been in deep trouble, and if we had any ventilation system, it would have been really bad. I've got a little red circle here, because there you can see it, like there's a little pocket and there's a radio, and there's all the part of the radio. In it, there was actually a first aid kit. There's also here a phone with a little electronic pen that helped us find the maps. And basically, this is the kind of thing that you might find in an space mission. Again, there you don't need to put the radio in the helmet. It helps, obviously, but in this case, you have the radio out and you have the connection in your ear, like bone conducting. And usually it works. It's quite simple. It's easy to find technology, and it's still very useful to do the simulation. First aid kit, you can put it there. You can also put it in backpacks, but if you have it in front, it's actually very practical to use it and find it. Another thing about complexity of spacesuits is the one size fits all, which can be problematic. And when I say one size fits all, again, price reason. The problem is if you have a crew of 6 people and they're all different sizes, you're not going to try to do 6 different spacesuits. You're going to try to do 2, maximum 3 different, or you're going to tell one of them, look, I'm sorry, you're too tall, you're too small to do an EVA. Like, you don't want to do that, obviously. And actually, on the European Space Agency, I think NASA, there's actually a size restriction. Astronauts cannot be too tall or too small, because otherwise they don't fit the commands and stuff. They do get, you know, they butt imprints molded, and they do so that when they Soyuz seat, when they launched, it actually really accommodates the pressure and comfort. But in Analogue space mission, you wouldn't have your own spacesuit and you wouldn't have your butt molded, okay? Normally you're gonna have to share it. It also makes for hygiene concerns sometimes, so please make sure you clean before you wear one, or as clean as you can be in an Analogue space mission. But yeah, so you're gonna have this design. You're gonna have to think, okay, we got 4, 5, 6 astronauts. We got maximum 2 spacesuits or 3 spacesuits. Do we do SML? What are the sizes? Are we going to use them for other missions? What is the main limiting factor? For example, if it's just very long sleeves, you could say, well, the sleeves you can put up. Normally you've got the gloves on top, so that's fine. The legs, for example, is already much more of a problem. If the legs are too short, this is what happened with us, is the inseam was too low, and actually that's what broke it. If it had been much higher, well, the trousers might fall a little bit, but you can try to put a belt on them. Or you could have, obviously, a jumpsuit. But so these are the kind of considerations that you have to really take into account. And speaking of gloves and boots, boots not necessarily something that is the main focus of our missions, but gloves, yes. And gloves is actually something that you can really transcribe to just space, because obviously, again, it's the flip of fingers. You don't have the same dexterity, you don't have the same ease and manipulation of things when you have gloves on. And it's not just normal gloves, it's gloves that have to be sometimes conductive if you want to use screens, for example. It's because maybe you want to try to hold a pen, but at the same time you need thermal protection and you need to be pressurized so there's no leak coming in. It's really, really complex to do work, and most people use this. They use those gloves. You know, you're not going to use your mouth or your feet to do anything, possibly like this with your arms, but normally your hands are really the one part that you actually need to handle things. It's if you ever seen an astronaut glove, it's really, really complex. It's really absolutely fantastic to see how they work. Gloves, obviously, in no missions you could just wear ski gloves if you're not in the desert. When you're in the desert, it's a bit warm. But the more complex they are, the more interesting it is, and the more akin it is to a real space mission. Helmet, I mentioned. So here you can see, for example, just a motorbike helmet. Still works pretty well. You still can put some space for it. You can still try to put some batteries. You can put a camera on top. You can change the visor and see if you want to add any extra layers on it, for example, to simulate radiation protection. So it can be quite interesting. The problem, obviously, if you want to make a complex helmet, is usually you want to have the complex spacesuit with it. For example, if you wanted to have ventilation and stuff like this, you're not going to put just ventilation there usually. Well, I mean, you can. I think that was done in high seas, but it's not necessarily practical. You might have differences in temperatures, and you might have a flow. So you might want to put a spacesuit that then just really latches on the helmet, and then you need the full pressurized spacesuit to go with that. So it adds really complexity quite quickly, although it makes it extremely interesting, and you can do quite a bit of experiments and research on it. And then additional gear, I didn't mention before, first aid kit, radio, etc, etc. Now, just before we wrap this up, talking about real spacesuits. So yeah, I mentioned about 16 layers of a spacesuit. Usually you have a head, upper torso, lower torso, depends really if you're trying to walk or not. And usually you have an absolutely huge portable life support system. So really this kind of absolutely massive backpack where you've got your heating system, ventilation system, also for oxygen, you've got the CO2 scrubber, You've got your water, just also thermoregulation, your radio, etc., etc. And there, the helmet you can normally put up and down a visor in case you got, you know, sun coming into your face and you need protection for that. The gloves are usually the parts that, as I mentioned, extremely important in the way that you need to be both warm enough and not too sweaty to do what you have to do. And usually the feet is not the part that you use the most, but obviously in an Analogue space mission that you would actually be walking possibly if you're not underwater. So you might need more ankle mobility than you would do in a normal spacesuit. So yeah, so this is for NASA. Just if you want to have a look into this the page, you can have a look at the link at the end. And here you can see the Roscosmos equivalent, so the Russian equivalent. So this is Orlan spacesuits, was on the ISS Expedition 40. That was Oleg Artemyev. And yeah, so this, for example, he had to use the spacesuit for about 5 hours and 11 minutes. Absolutely huge in 2014. And if you look at it, his spacesuit is about 115 kilos. And obviously, well, microgravity, so it's not as bad as if you were on Earth. But still, you do have to really find some ways to get used to it. So you have to do those trainings in the neutral buoyancy lab. On Earth, you have to really train into this donning and doffing. Again, think a little hole in this could be an absolute chaos. I'm going to tell you a few other stories about spacesuits. Luca Parmitano, who's an astronaut for ESA, a few years back almost drowned in his spacesuit. There was a leak of water in his spacesuits, and the problem is in microgravity the water doesn't just go down, it's going to form a bubble, and that bubble might actually go on your eye or in your nose, and you're in a spacesuit. You can't just pull your arm out and go and do like this in your helmet, and you can't do this, you can't remove your helmet. He was doing the EVA. So that was really scary, and you wouldn't think you'd drown in space, but actually yes, it's possible. So that was a very, very like stressful, yeah, adventure, but he did survive. He was able to come to be brought back into the ISS, and he was saved and was fine. And now every time an astronaut feels there's a bit of water running, they really check that there's not a leak in the water system, should it be drinking water or thermal system. But a few years after that, it was Chris Hadfield, the Canadian Space Agency astronaut, who felt some water, and actually was mostly perspiration, but actually the problem is that perspiration touched the inside of this helmet, his visor. There had been an anti-fog material sprayed on it, and then again the droplets of sweat went and they formed and they went into his eyes, and he tried to remove it, but the problem is the mix actually became aggressive and toxic, and it attacked his eye, and he couldn't really see anymore. Not seeing in space on an EVA, really, really not a fun thing. You don't even have gravity to really orient yourself. If you were to become blind now, like if you're going running or something, you become blind, okay, well actually you still feel what is up and down. You can hold yourself and that's it. When you're in space, you have no idea where you are. So that was extremely dangerous. So just to give you an idea why spacesuits are absolutely crucial for space missions, but also very, very complex. And for those analog missions, you cannot simulate necessarily everything. Even in a neutral buoyancy lab, you wouldn't be able to experience those things like the water droplet coming into your face, or you can do a lot, but you're still limited. So it's quite interesting, and really don't judge an analog space mission just because of their spacesuits. And there, I thought you would like that picture, but I hope you've signed up for an analog space mission now and are you still enjoying this course. See you next time.